This is the 5th video in the series on how to build an engine in the card game Dominion, and this video focuses on trashing, which is the third key engine component. So by default in a game of Dominion, if you play a card, it doesn't get spent up and leave your deck permanently. It gets sent back to your discard pile at the end of the turn, where it will later be reshuffled into your deck, and your deck will continue to cycle through itself. And that's good for good cards. You don't want to lose them after the first time you play them. But for a lot of cards, you might not necessarily want them to be in your deck, and so you want to get rid of them for good. And trashing is how you do that. If you trash a card, it doesn't go back into your discard pile or into your deck. It goes to the trash pile, where it is no longer part of your deck, out of sight, out of mind. And so that's what we'll be focusing on in this video. And you'll see some cards interact with the effect of trashing. For example, there might be a card that gives you a point if you trash a card, or there might be a card that has a beneficial effect if it gets trashed. And if you see cards like that, note that for technical purposes of interpreting cards and understanding the rules correctly, a card counts as trashing very literally just if it uses the verb trash. So if card A says trash the other card, and then card B says if I get trashed, give a benefit, that counts as trashing because card A literally used the verb trash. And so that's how you should interpret cards for rules questions. Now we're talking about strategy here. And so we're going to be focused less on the technical rules and more of what the function of trashing is strategically. And so in a second, when we look at specific cards, we will see that there's a number of cards that don't use the verb trashing. And so for technical purposes won't count as trashing, but they achieve the same function. They'll get the card out of your deck in other ways. And so in talking about trashing as an engine component, as a thing that an engine can have, we're going to include those in the analysis of trashing. And so we'll be talking about cards that get cards out of your deck, whether or not they are technically trashers, under the broader umbrella of trashing. So now let's talk about the value of trashing. So there's a few main reasons why an engine really wants to trash its cards. First, and one you'll see very early on in the game, is that the more you trash your bad cards, the more frequently you see your good cards. If you add one good card to your deck, and it's stranded in a sea of 20 coppers and curses and such, you're only going to see that every few turns, and it's not going to pay itself off very quickly. In fact, if you add that late in the game, you might buy it. 4 turns later, the game ends before you even draw it the first time. And so the value of every card in your deck is going down if it's diluted by a number of other worse cards. And so adding good cards to your deck will have less benefit. If you trash the bad cards, you start to see that card every turn or every other turn, and it pays itself off much more quickly. So you get this snowball effect of good cards pay themselves off faster. Secondly, we said at the very outset, the main reasons we build an engine is to draw the entire deck. With an engine, we don't just want to see one hand's worth of cards. We want to find all of our cards and get the full benefit of our deck every turn that we play it. We want to get to that state as quickly as possible. And one of the biggest hurdles for that is drawing all the cards. So one of the other main benefits of trashing is that to draw your deck, if it's well trashed and you've gotten the junk out of the way, you've substantially reduced the amount of draw power necessary to draw the entire deck. And as we'll see in a demonstration, that actually really reduces the amount that you need to build, because some of the hardest cards to acquire are draw cards. And then a final benefit, trashing improves reliability and reduces your chances of dudding. You might decide, I value these coppers, I value these estates, I'd rather keep them in my deck, and I'll add more draw cards if that's what's necessary to draw them. But even if you do end up adding 10 extra draw power to your deck to draw through the 10 starting cards, you still have this potential problem, which is you have to find those draw cards first to make sure that you can draw through the rest of the cards. And if you have 10 coppers / estates in your deck, you very well might draw a starting hand of 3 copper to estate, or 5 coppers. And if you don't find those draw cards to begin with, you dud before your turn ever gets off the ground. And so the more dud cards you have in your deck, the more likely it is that you draw 5 of the bad cards, and your turn never kicks off in the first place. So lastly, when should you trash your cards? Well, a slight oversimplification, but one that'll be true 95% of the time, is if you can trash your starting cards, you should. Estates and coppers are not good cards, and they get in the way, and so it's almost always worth it, even if there's only a relatively weak trasher around in the kingdom, to invest in trashing those cards, because the payoff tends to be pretty immense, and it tends to stack on itself, because the more you trash your cards, the more value the other good cards do for you. And then, suppose you decided you should trash your cards, when in the game should you do it? Well, the answer is generally as soon as possible. It tends to be that your opening buys are often focused on how to get your deck as thin as possible, as quick as possible, and how to get the bad cards trashed, because that's usually the first step in getting your engine up and running. And so almost always your opening should focus on how do I trash my cards, and how to do it soon. So now let's look at some examples. So we'll look at examples of specific trashing cards and go more in depth on those in a second. But before we do that, I'll demonstrate one point that I was making about the value of trashing with this kingdom. So here we have a sample kingdom. We've played through it a bit to get a particular deck state, which you can see all the cards down here in the bottom. And we're going to look at how valuable trashing can be. So we've got a Wandering Minstrel. We got 7 of these. It's basically a village. It's got a nice fancy effect. Not one that will be relevant here though. Just note we have 7 villages. We've got 5 smithies. We got 7 laboratories. We got some market squares for plus buy. We got a whole bunch of treasures and estates. And so let's see if we can draw our deck. We should already know how to calculate this from the draw video. How much draw do we have? Well, market square is neutral. It's a cantrip. Wandering Minstrel is also draw neutral, so we can ignore those 2 stacks. Let's compare our draw to our stop cards. We've got 5 starting draw naturally, plus 10 draw from the 5 smithies. That's 15 draw, plus 7 labs, each of which net us 1 draw. So we have 22 total draw power between the smithies, labs, and our initial 5-card hand. And then how many cards do we have that are stop cards? Well, we have 14 golds and 3 silvers, so 17 treasures, and 5 estates makes 22. So we should be able to draw through our deck here if we play through it. And sure enough, we have 2 cards left. We're going to draw those. We just made it through our deck exactly. So now we're going to see how well we can do if we trash a few cards. So what do I donate? Donate it costs 8, but we have more than 8. We can afford that. And donate allows you to look at any number of cards and trash as many as you want. This is actually the interface we were in a second ago. So in my buy phase and enter the donate phase. So let's say I decide to get rid of these estates because they're not doing anything for me, right? So I'm going to trash the 5 estates. I still want to draw my deck, but now I've got room to spare because I've got 5 fewer stop cards. So how much can I get rid of? Well, we said every card is implicitly -1, so an estate is -1 draw. So if I get rid of 5 estates, I could very well get rid of 5 laboratories, and these were all +1. So if I'm getting rid of 5 -1 draw cards and 5 +1 draw cards, this should cancel out. I should still be able to draw my deck. So let's go ahead and try that. And sure enough, we've just exactly drawn our deck again. And now let's say I wanted to add estates back in. Like I wanted to buy 3 estates. And then I wanted to continue to draw my deck. What would I need to buy? Well, to cover the draw of 3 estates, which is now -3 cards, I need to buy 3 labs. And so now my deck can still draw itself again. Let me just undo those last 6 buys. And so here's the main point of this, is let's say you've got a card that can trash your estates, right? Now obviously you're not going to be in the in-game state like this, where you've got huge amounts of draw and buy, etc. You're going to be in the early stages of the game, and you're considering getting a card that can trash estates. So how much value does it do to your deck to trash 1 estate? Well, as we saw, 1 estate fewer in your deck is 1 less laboratory that you'll need in order to draw it. So getting 3 estates out of your deck is basically getting rid of the need to get 3 more laboratories. You'll be able to draw your deck with 3 fewer laboratories. So let's look at the value of that. Just buying a single lab, it takes a buy and it takes 5 coins, and that's not cheap, right? 5 cost cards can often be hard to acquire, especially in large quantities. But what if you got just like a simple $3 trasher like Hermit, or $2 trasher like Chapel, and you use that 1 chapel to trash just 3 estates, right? Each estate trashed is functionally reducing the need to buy 1 laboratory in order to reach that in-game state of drawing your deck. Now imagine you trash the coppers too, right? Each of those coppers is also 1 extra laboratory that you need. And so it can be really expensive and difficult to add large amounts of draw, whether that be by adding a laboratory per card, or adding a smithy which draws 2 cards, but it costs an action. So if you add a smithy, you've got to add a village as well. And so no matter how you slice it, adding a bunch of draw cards is pretty expensive. And so if you can invest in a cheap early game trasher that gets rid of your estates and coppers early on, you're saving yourself huge amounts of necessary draw down the road. And so it just far outweighs any potential benefit of having 3 points from the estates at the end of the game, or having like 1 treasure from the copper. And so this should hopefully demonstrate why trashing is just almost always beneficial. And so now in the next segment of the video, we will look at some examples of trashing cards and when they're good, when they're not, etc. Now we'll look at some examples of cards that count as trashing. So first we have the sort of prototypical trashing card from the base set, Chapel. Chapel, literally its only effect is trash up to 4 cards from your hand. I think the normal reaction most people have when they first play the game of Dominion, and it's usually with the base set, they see this Chapel card and they're like, why would I want to do that? It has no positive benefit. All it does is force me to trash cards from my own deck. Why would I ever buy that? At the very least, I remember that was my reaction. First time I played Dominion, I was playing with a friend, and I was just like, there's this Chapel card in the kingdom. Why would I ever buy that? And he told me, well, in this kingdom, you wouldn't. But there's this other card in the base set called Witch, and it can give you curses, and you can buy the Chapel if you want to get rid of your curses. And like that's the main reason you want Chapels, to get rid of those curses. And I was like, oh, that makes sense. I was very wrong. He was very wrong. In fact, Chapel is arguably the single strongest card and the single most universally valuable card in the base set. And that's because trashing is so valuable, and Chapel just does it so incredibly well. In almost every game with Chapel, what you would do is you'd buy your Chapel turn 1 or turn 2 before you shuffle your deck for the first time, and then you're going to draw Chapel, and you're just going to immediately trash every card in your hand with the Chapel. Just trash all the coppers, all the estates, whatever you find. You're going to very quickly get all those cards out of your deck, and soon you're going to have a deck that's like 5 cards in it, but it's only going to be 5 good cards. And so then the benefit of Chapel is very quickly you get down to a deck that's just good cards. So the moment you buy a good card, it's directly back in your deck, you're finding it every turn, and the deck's just going to snowball incredibly powerful. So Chapel is just the most game warping card in the base set. It trashes incredibly well, incredibly quickly, incredibly cheaply, and so certainly if you can open with Chapel, you almost always should. It's just a very powerful trasher. Another example of a trashing card from the base set would be Moneylender. Here you can trash a copper, and then you get a little benefit. So Moneylender is a little bit slower, definitely weaker than Chapel, but not a bad card. It trashes coppers more slowly, but with some benefit. Now let's look at a few examples of cards that aren't technically trashing, but functionally could count as trashing for most intents and purposes. So one example from the most recent expansion is Sanctuary. Sanctuary has +1 card, +1 action, +1 buy, and then it has this text at the bottom that says you can exile a card from your hand, which this is a new introduction to the game. This only applies to the newest expansion. The exile mat is just a mat where you can put cards off to the side, and they still technically count as yours for scoring purposes. So if you exile an estate or a province, that still counts as your points, but it's not in your deck anymore. You're just setting it off to the side and it gets out of the way. So Sanctuary does not count as technically trashing, but it achieves the same functional benefit, which you can take a card you don't want, like your copper or your estate, and you can set it aside, put it in your exile mat, and just forget about it. And so you achieve the main goal of trashing, which is to get that card out of your deck. In fact, you sort of got a minor benefit, which is that estate will still be worth 1 point for you at the end of the turn if you set it aside with Sanctuary. So Sanctuary is, for all intents and purposes, a trashing card, because exiling a junk card from your hand is about as valuable as trashing it in almost all contexts. Secondly, here's an example from an earlier expansion, Island. Island is very similar to Sanctuary. Island lets you put a card from your hand onto the island mat, which again is just another mat that you set this card aside. It's still technically yours, but it's out of sight, out of mind, not in your deck anymore. So Island can help you get cards out of your deck that maybe you want to hold on to for scoring purposes, like a province, but you don't want it to be in your deck taking up space. So you can set your province aside with an island, and it's still technically worth 6 points, and it's still technically yours, but it's not getting in the way. And then thirdly, Ambassador. Ambassador allows you to reveal 2 cards from your hand, return up to 2 back to the supply pile, and then your opponent gains 1. So Ambassador is a third card that doesn't technically trash. Again, to technically kind of trashing has to say the verb trash somewhere, and it doesn't. But it's achieving the same end, which is you take a card that was in your hand, and you send it back to the supply. You've gotten it out of your deck. And it has that benefit of junking your opponent. So you can not only get estates and coppers out of your deck, but you can shove them into your opponent's deck. And your opponent suddenly doesn't want them, because hopefully your opponent understands the value of trashing and would rather not have those cards either. And so Ambassador is a very strong card. It's actually about as strong as Chapel is, because although it's only quote-unquote trashing 2 of your cards, you return 2, whereas Chapel can trash up to 4, it's also giving your opponent an extra card. So it's 1 more card they need to trash. So Ambassador's sort of net value of making your deck thinner than your opponent's is like +2 trashing for you, -1 trashing for your opponent. And so Ambassador is quite a strong card. You'll find it's actually one of the best, if not the best, 3-cost cards. Now I'll show some examples of where these cards that sort of functionally, but don't technically trash, can differ in implementation from cards that do trash. One example is Tomb points. So Tomb is a landmark where if you trash a card, you get +1. So if you play Chapel and trash 4 cards, you get 4 points. You play Moneylender, you trash 1 card, you get 1 point. If you get rid of the cards in your deck by using Sanctuary to exile them all, or putting them back into supply with Ambassador and sending them over to your opponent, you're not getting Tomb points. So here's an example of a card where cards that functionally are trashing might be slightly different than cards that technically trash, because they're not getting extra points. So this is around maybe you value technically trasher cards slightly more. And then the second example is a card like Fortress. If you trash a card with Fortress, Fortress goes back into your hand. I phrased that poorly. If you trash Fortress with a card, put it into your hand. So you don't trash cards with Fortress. Fortress gets trash. And so Fortress can be helpful for cards where you get a benefit from trashing them, like Apprentice. Apprentice, where if you trash a card, you can draw a bunch. And so cards like Apprentice really like cards like Fortress, where Fortress is, it's got a lot of, it's a decently highly valuable card at 4. And so there's a lot of cards where it's like the more valuable the card you trash, the bigger the effect you get. And so there's usually a trade-off for those cards where if you trash high value cards, you get a good effect, but you lose them. Fortress lets you have your cake and eat it too, where you trash the Fortress, get the big benefit, for example, drawing 4 cards with Apprentice, but then you don't actually lose the Fortress, it goes right back to your hand. So Fortress works really well with trashing cards. Just note that Fortress, for example, this effect doesn't trigger if you Sanctuaried it. If you put the Fortress in your exile mat, it just stays there. It doesn't go back to your hand, because exiling doesn't technically count as Fortress. So for purposes like Tomb and Fortress, these are the sort of exceptions to the rule where cards like Sanctuary, Island, Ambassador aren't functionally trashing for those purposes. But for the main reason you trash most hands, which is just getting cards out of your deck, Sanctuary, Island, and Ambassador should be thought of as trashers. A few more examples. There's some cards that can only trash specific types of cards. So for example, Moneylender can only trash coppers. And so you would be able to get rid of your coppers, but not your estates. So you might need to add, for example, a Jack of all trades to your deck. Jack of all trades is this effect which you can trash a non-treasure from your hand. So Jack of all trades can trash estates, it can trash curses if you have them, but it can't trash coppers. So you put Moneylender and Jack of all trades together, they kind of cover each other's bases. Moneylender can trash the coppers, Jack of all trades can trash the estates, and then you can get trashed from there. And so sometimes you have a card that trashes some, but not all. Another important thing to look at with trashing is there's some cards that technically trash from your deck, but kind of fail to achieve the main purpose of trashing. And we'll look for examples of that in Taxman and Ducat. So we said it back at the beginning, the main purpose of trashing is to get unneeded cards out of your deck. You're trying to make your deck thinner with fewer cards in it, so you have less need of draw. So take a look at Taxman. You can trash a treasure from your hand, and you can replace it with another treasure. Now, the treasure can be worth more, so you can like turn your copper into your silver, into a silver. You can turn your silver into a gold. Taxman's certainly doing something productive for you, which is it's sort of advancing your treasures up the line to be more valuable. And so it's not nothing. But part of the reason Taxman is such a weak card, and you'll find that it's rated very lowly in terms of strength, is that it's not making your deck any thinner. You're getting rid of one treasure, replacing it with another. If my main goal is to make my deck thin so I can find my key action cards more, I don't necessarily want a silver any more than I want a copper. You'll find that a lot of ancient decks, they just don't want a whole lot of treasure to begin with because it's just getting in the way. And so Taxman can be pretty bad for trashing purposes because although it trashes you a card, it replaces with another, you still have just as many stop cards as before to draw. And so Taxman's kind of weak. Similarly, Ducat. When you gain a Ducat, you can trash a copper from your hand. Ducat is slightly better than a copper. You get a coffer instead of a coin. A coffer is just like a coin that can roll over from turn to turn, and you get a buy. So it's not like, totally bad. Turning a copper into a Ducat is an improvement. But note that to get the trash effect of trashing the copper, you have to put a Ducat into your deck, which is more or less a glorified copper. So you've trashed one card, but by gaining another stop card. So you haven't really thinned your deck at all, because you replaced the copper with the Ducat. And so Taxman and Ducat, they don't really thin your deck at all. Now here's a neat little action though. What if you played the Taxman and you had Ducat in the kingdom, so they're both around. You turn your copper with the Taxman effect into a Ducat. You've now gained a Ducat, and because you gained a Ducat, you can now trash another copper. So if you had Taxman and Ducat around, technically they could achieve the goal trashing is trying to achieve, which is you trash one copper with Taxman, turn it into a Ducat, you broke even, you trash one card, gain another card, and then you also get to trash a copper with this effect. So technically Taxman plus Ducat would actually thin your deck by 1 and would remove 1 stop card from your deck. But either in isolation actually can't. And so these are pretty weak if your purpose is to make your deck thinner, because they don't actually reduce the number of stop cards in your deck. They just remove 1 stop card and replace it with a slightly less bad stop card. And then of course there's also some events and other non-card card-shaped things that can trash cards. So for example, Bonfire. Trash up to 2 cards you have in play. Bonfire is great at trashing coppers. You play the coppers, you buy Bonfire, you trash the coppers from play. You can't trash estates though, so that's Bonfire's big weakness, is functionally speaking, this is a restricted trasher just like Moneylender, because you can't get your estates in play, barring some very exceptional circumstances. Or look at Banish. Banish is another event that falls in the same category as Sanctuary, Ambassador, or Island, and not technically trashing your cards. But it does let you exile cards, any number of them, from your hand. So if you could like draw your deck and exile all your states, all your coppers at once, you get them all out of your deck, you've achieved the same purpose. So here's another example. And the last one to look at is Donate. Donate is definitely, I think without a shadow of a doubt, the single strongest thing you could buy in Dominion. And that's just because it is the best way to trash cards in the game, bar none. And trashing is just so incredibly valuable that you always want to do it. So if you wanted to know what the single best thing you could ever buy on average in a game of Dominion is, it's Donate. If Donate's around, it just fundamentally warps strategy even more than Chapel does. Maybe you are familiar with how much Chapel can influence base games, Donate is like the expansion version of Chapel. It's even more strong. Donate is so strong that you wouldn't even consider opening Chapel just because it's so much better at trashing. Literally, you're taking 8 debt, and so people might be afraid, at the face of it, like 8 debt, that's a lot. In case you're unfamiliar, this little hexagon means debt, and debt just means you pay 8 for it, but you don't have to pay 8 up front. So you can buy Donate even if you can't afford it, and then you pay it back over the next few turns by paying 8 as you go. And the restriction is you can't buy anything else until you're out of debt. And so you might be thinking, well, I could buy Donate early on, but I'd go into 8 debt, and that's a lot. 8 is a big number for the start of the game. And so people might be afraid of it. But the benefit is literally immediately, the moment you buy it, at the end of your turn, you put all your cards in hand, and you trash whatever cards you want. So you just sort of trash down to your ideal deck state. And that often involves trashing all your states, and often all your coppers. Sometimes you might leave a few coppers around in the short term because you need the money, and then redonate again to get rid of them. But basically, you just immediately trash down to only the cards you want. And yeah, you're now in debt by 8, but the benefit of that is just so incredibly large. It pays itself off almost immediately, and it's just sort of almost impossible to win if you don't donate and your opponent does, because it's just so good at trashing, and the benefits of trashing early are so huge that it pays for itself almost instantaneously. So if you ever want to know strongest card Dominion, it's Donate. Reason? It trashes really well.